Hey, everybody, welcome to Old Man Squad Fantasy Basketball. I'm Dan Besbris, and I trimmed my facial hair. That's right. Most important thing on today's show. Second most important thing on today's show is that we are busting into the Northwest Division today with a trip down. And it's not coincidence that I'm generally pairing the complicated team with a less complicated team when we do these breakdowns, because if I did two complicated teams, we'd have like a 65, 70-minute podcast. And frankly, none of you has the patience for that. And I don't have the vocal strength or time for that anymore. Today, we're looking at the Portland Trail Blazers and the Minnesota Timberwolves, the teams of adjective noun combo mascot. Not just a blazer, you blaze trails. You're not just a wolf, you're a Timberwolf. I was talking to somebody recently. Can't remember who it was now. Might have been Ray over at Basketball Intelligence. If he's listening, he can make sure that was not misattributing. The there's a nomenclature battle going on in the NBA that many of us are not aware of, and it's the battle between those that refer to the team in Minnesota as the Wolves, the Timberwolves, or the T-Wolves. And apparently, the locals in Minnesota think that anybody that calls the team the T-Wolves is an idiot. Luckily, I very rarely use that abbreviation, so I feel like I Neo-Matrix dodged a bullet there. I think I generally just call them the Wolves or the Timberwolves. Go the full name. Anyway, we're going to talk about them today. I don't know anybody that calls them the T-Blazers. I can tell you immediately that made me feel like an idiot. Blazers, though, yeah, there just isn't that third one. Should we call them the Timber Blazers? Could stand for that. I think we do Portland first, so we kind of know how much time we have left to talk about the Trail Wolves. And Portland is the more complicated team, so it kind of makes sense this way. Blazers last year were an obvious tank team once they got rid of Damian Lillard. The tank was on, and the only question that remained was how they were going to do it. What were going to be the methods to the madness? Was it going to be a pre-tank? Was it going to be a tank throughout? Was it going to be give partial effort for a lot of the season and then abandon ship completely at the end? And the answer was a little bit of everything. Sort of a tank throughout. What more do you need to see than the games played totals for the competent players on the Blazers? Players on the Blazers are forever more known as Blazers. DeAndre Ayton, a robust 55 games played. Anthony Simons, an equally robust 46 games played. Jeremy Grant, a Pistons-era Jeremy Grant level 54 games played. And those are obviously the big ones. Time Lord Robert Williams, he was legitimately hurt earlier in the year, then missed the whole season after playing in 6 basketball games. Malcolm Brogdon, who was traded mid-season, managed to appear traded just now, I should say, for Deni Avdija, not mid-season. Shut down mid-season. Played in a embarrassing, it's not robust anymore. Once you drop under the 50% threshold, 39 ball games this past year. So we didn't know how they were going to do it in terms of who was going to rest and when. We knew, maybe I need to rephrase that. We knew how they were going to do it. They weren't going to let those guys play an entire season. The question that was answered during the year was, how are they going to split it up? There really isn't much of a reason to think the Blazers are going to be all that much better this season. They got Donovan Clingan in the draft, and they traded Malcolm Brogdon, who was the veteran backcourt leader, for Deni Avdija, who's significantly younger, and I would argue more interesting at this point in his NBA career than Malcolm Brogdon. But, these are not moves that magically turned the Blazers from a barely win team to an often win team. I mean, Portland was truly bad last year. What was the final record on the Blazers? 21-61. They had the worst record in the Western Conference. Would have been tied with the Hornets for the third worst record in the East. But regardless, they were effectively bottom 3. Technically, I think they were bottom 4, depending on how the tiebreakers went. That's really bad. That's real bad. The subtractions to the Blazers this offseason have been largely the backcourt. It's largely Malcolm Brogdon. In terms of guys that actually saw the floor, he's kind of the only one that is now gone. He's headed to Washington. And by the way, Wizards don't have a... Tyus Jones is a free agent. Brogdon might get to play. Well, we'll deal with that when we get to Washington. The Blazers have now, I would argue, much more of a logjam in the front court than, I say much larger, but certainly bigger. They added a power forward in Deni Avdija, good ball-moving power forward, and they added a center in the draft in Klingon. They already had 3 centers that played fairly significant minutes last year when they were upright. Time Lord was going to play a decent amount when upright, and then he went down. And then Duop Reith slid into that role. And DeAndre Ayton, obviously, whenever he was healthy, he was the starting 5. That I don't see changing. Ayton's still on a pretty sizable contract. I'm sure that they'll shut him down for a third of the year again this coming season. Because, look, like Blazers, even if you think they got like a win or 2 better, going from 21 wins to 22 or 23, that doesn't get you anywhere near the playoffs. And trading Brogdon away, who was probably the guy that made that team the most functional on a night-to-night basis. Okay, now your backcourt is Scoot and Simons, if Anthony's even there at the start of the season. We'll grade it out as though he is. Simons is being treated like he's some kind of veteran, but he's still a really young dude, too. How the hell old is Anthony Simons right now? Couldn't be that old. 3rd, 4th year in the NBA or something like that. Born in 99. Dude just turned 25. Drafted in 2008. This guy's not a veteran. Compared to some of these dudes he is, but he's not a traditional veteran. And I like Simons, and I like Ayton enough, and Jeremy Grant is fine, but that combination isn't getting you anywhere. So by all accounts, the Blazers are probably in tank mode for another year, especially when you consider the fact that Scoot Henderson really didn't turn any kind of learning curve corner in his initial NBA campaign. Oh, they gave him the ball at the end of the year. Make no mistake, Scoot had basketball at the tail end of the season. And there were a lot of assists to be had during that stretch. But there were so many mistakes and none had really been ironed out. If you're looking now, I'm putting it on the screen for those that are watching. The final 15 games of last year, Scoot played 34 minutes a night almost, averaged 18 and 7.5 with 1.4 steals and over 2 3-pointers on a high volume, 41.5% shooting and 5 turnovers a game. Silly season superhero Delano Banton had a really nice closing stretch to this year. But again, I think we have to treat the Blazers, at least going into fantasy drafts, on who's healthy now, which is, by all accounts, all of them. So I would expect Ayton is your starting center to begin the year. Simons is your starting 2 guard to begin the year. Jeremy Grant, provided he is not traded before the season starts, which is very much a possibility, is your starting 3. And recently acquired Deni Avdija is your starting 4. Those are your guys. So Banton, he'll play off the bench. And whoever else, Jabari Walker, will play off the bench. And Reith will play off the bench. And if Time Lord resurfaces at some point, he'll play off the bench. And Tumani Kamara will play off the bench. And you kind of don't have to worry about those guys. Because, look, even when Banton was putting up eye-popping counting stat numbers, he was so unbelievably atrocious for your field goal percent that if you weren't punting that, he was actually doing more harm than good. Physically losing you a category almost by himself down the stretch. So what does that mean we should do with these guys? That, of course, is where this all comes rolling back together. So let's look at the sort of, let's break it down from a name by name, piece by piece situation here, and we can kind of take it from there. DeAndre Ayton was number 40 last year on a per game basis, 16.7 points, 11 rebounds, a steal, and 0.8 blocks. He got off to a crazy fast start in steals this year that, not surprisingly, came back to earth as the season went on. He's not a big defensive stats center, and this was probably a bit above what you should expect for this coming season in defense. But everything else is relatively repeatable for him, right down to the games played, which is 2/3 of a season for Ayton. 32 minutes a game, the points, the boards, all that stuff seems pretty repeatable. So maybe you ratchet the steals down a tiny bit and you put him somewhere in that 50 range, which on a team that, again, I don't know when they'll decide to give him days off when they give him days off, and he'll have a nagging ankle injury that'll cost him 2 weeks, and all that silly thing would be happening. It's going to make him a really hard guy to draft in head-to-head leagues that don't have a games cap. I would strongly recommend against drafting DeAndre Ayton in a head-to-head league without a games cap. Roto games cap formats, it's going to depend a bit on where he gets drafted, because when you're putting up relatively solid center numbers, which I would argue he did, but missing a third of the season, you're probably, and I don't know that this is going to be true, probably going to fall a bit in drafts. Like, so for instance, this last year, per game, 40, totals 86 for Ayton. So by one metric, he beat his ADP, which was near 50, and by the other, he lost to it. And on the head-to-head side, the totals is actually more important for a guy like that, because taking zeros is doubly offensive to a fantasy team. Whereas Games Cap Roto, it sucks. You have to replace 27 missed games at your center spot, but you can find some hot free agent there. So what's better? Finding a center that isn't ranked as high per game but plays in more? Or Ayton for 55 games and then 27 games of some other top 100 center? In a games cap format, it's generally that second option. And you can grade it out at the end of the season, but, this is a guy that you could get. I don't know where Ayton's going to go this coming year. Again, my assumption is that people know he's going to sit for a while. So hopefully he falls outside the top 55 or 60. But if he does get into that range, Roto games cap, I probably would take a look at him. Earlier than that, I think you can do better. I think you could probably find somebody, like if you're thinking about drafting Ayton at 50 or 55, you probably shouldn't be, because there will almost definitely be another center out there that'll do some facsimile of what Ayton was doing. Maybe you don't get quite to top 40 per game. Maybe you get like a top 50 center. But if that top 50 center plays in 75 games instead of Ayton's 55, that combination of 75 games from the better one plus 7 games of a pickup versus 55 games of Ayton, who, again, a little bit ahead on a per game side, but you got to fill in 27, that now becomes the worse option. Let's talk Anthony Simons, because that dude only played in 46 games last year. So by totals, he was number 188. Per game, he was number 94. And I think that's going to surprise a lot of people, because per game, he was putting up some pretty gaudy numbers. Simons, 22.5 points, 3.5 3-pointers, 3.5 rebounds, 5.5 assists, 91.5% at the free throw line. But herein lies the rub. Really bad field goal percent impact, 43% on super high volume, and literally no defensive stats at all. We're talking Danilo Gallinari bad in defensive stats. 0.5 steals in starters minutes and 0.1 blocks. By the way, shout out to Anthony Simons for getting inside the top 100 without any defensive stats to speak of. It's actually quite difficult to be a top 100 player while doing nothing defensively. He might be the worst. He may be the lowest combined defensive stats guy that actually made the top 100 at 0.6. I don't think anybody was lower than that. Quick scan would suggest that no, he is the worst defensive stats dude of any fantasy player inside the top 100. It's quite a moniker. Tip your cap to Anthony Simons. In fact, he's the worst defensive stats guy at 0.6 combined of anybody inside. I'm scrolling here. I want to get the number right. He might be the lowest in the NBA. Like among qualifying fantasy player, I'm seeing a lot of 0.9s. I'm finding some dudes that are 0.9 combined. Malik Beasley at 0.8. He was number 159 last year. 0.8. That's the next one. So it tells you how much Simons did in other categories, and it does make him a more appealing player on the head-to-head side, because if you're punting steals, he's actually a pretty reasonable guard to have. All those points and all those threes and the okay assists and the nice positive free throw percent actually did enough to counterweight the worst defensive stat production of anyone inside the top 160. Woof. Would I draft Simons if he fell to me at pick 94 again? Yeah, why the hell not? Roto games cap, I think he'll play more than 46 games this coming year. I don't think it'll be that many. I don't think he's playing 70 games, but I think he'll get into the high 50s, low 60s probably. And that's useful in games cap formats because, again, he's giving you all this stuff. And the old man squad style of drafting tends to be pretty bulky on defensive stats. So if you got one dude on your team that's just doing quite literally as close to nothing as you can get, which is what Simons is in that combined defensive department. He's kind of the anti-old man squad player, but he provides a certain thing that the old dudes don't, which is robust scoring and threes. Not a guy I'm targeting because he'll probably go earlier than mid-90s, but you never know. Would I touch Jeremy Grant while he remains in Portland? I think the answer is no, because it looks like he's down throttled so hard on anything outside of just taking shots that his fantasy game has turned to not even a well-polished turd anymore. Just like a turd that somebody sprayed some Windex on. Didn't even bother to wipe it off. We're all old enough. I feel like all of us on this show, speaking on this show or listening on this show, are old enough to remember when Jeremy Grant had a fun fantasy game. Wasn't that long ago, but it feels like a really long time ago. That season in Denver was the one that we were all looking at like, what if he parlayed this into, instead of 26 minutes, what if he took this stat set and just boosted it by another 20%? Because he was at 12 points, 3.5 boards, 1.2 assists, 0.7 steals, 0.8 blocks, and 1.43 pointers. So in all of our minds, we were looking at it and we were like, okay, he's shooting 48% in this situation. Could we get him to be, I don't know, like 1.7 threes and call it 4.5 rebounds and 2 assists and over a steal and a block? And, to Jeremy's credit, he did nuzzle up against some of those numbers during his Detroit time, while admittedly, again, barely playing in any basketball games. He played in 54 out of 72 and then 47 out of 82 during those two very sour seasons in Detroit, and as part of the whole Jeremy Grant perfectly happy taking a ton of money and only playing in 2/3 of a season situation. But in those Detroit years, he was at 22 points, 4.5 boards, almost 3 assists, and 1.7 defensive stats with 2.1 threes. And then the next one around, he was at 19, 4, and 2.5. His minutes were a little lower that year. But of course, his field goal percent never got anywhere near where it was during his OKC and Denver seasons, when he wasn't just casting away from three and playing alongside Nikola Jokic. And really, since he went to Portland, you've seen a downturn in just caring. 0.6 blocks per game for Grant is the worst he's put up in his career, including the seasons where he didn't get close to starters minutes. You go back to the very beginning for him, which was Philly. He blocked 1.6 shots a game in 27 minutes one of those years. This season, he blocked 0.6 in 34 minutes a game. The steals have always kind of hovered around 0.8 ish in starters minutes. That's not too far off. But the blocks being that low and the rebounds being that low, despite all those minutes, that just tells you he's not interested. He's on another tanking team. We don't know if he cares or not. It seems like, frankly, he's perfectly happy to not have to go full bore for all 82 games and beat up his body for a championship. Jeremy Grant seems comfortable doing what a lot of us do with our day jobs, which is don't give our whole ass and get paid the same amount as if we did. 'Tis the Jeremy way, and that's okay. We've been programmed to expect all NBA players to care way more about the title than anything else. There are guys, and Grant is not the only one. There are guys in the NBA that care more about just having a nice standard of living in a place that they feel comfortable and and not breaking their body for 80 games. Being able to, you know what? Hey, I woke up feeling a little sore today. Okay, take a week. Oh, your soreness is still bad? Take 2 more. That's a great lifestyle. And at the end of it all, in 10 more years, if Grant can look back and say, you know what, I don't mind that I didn't go ring chasing, then fine. So be it. But from our standpoint, on the fantasy side, if he's not going to give the first flying you know what about boards and blocks, he doesn't do enough in other things to make up for it. Points and threes from a power forward who's not putting up a good field goal percent is, pip, I can get that out of a guard. And a guard might get me a few assists or one more, or I don't know, or more than a steal. So Grant doesn't care anymore. That's what I'm seeing, at least. And we'll never know. And I'm sure if somebody was like, Grant, are you playing your hardest? He'd be like, of course. But we can all see, like, we've seen what he's been when he is playing his hardest. And it's more than this. Anywho, what are we leaving out so far? I wouldn't worry about Robert Williams. He'll surface when he surfaces. You don't have to draft him. Let's talk Deni Avdija and Scoot Henderson. Scoot is someone you're literally only drafting if you're punting both turnovers and field goal percent, because we didn't really see him turn a corner on any of those things. Probably get some points and you'll get a bunch of assists out of him this year, but he's going to be destroying multiple categories. So, yeah, I mean, there'll be plenty of head-to-head teams where, you're leaning into the big guard build and that type of stuff doesn't really cost you. But I still think that avoiding the guys that, like, if you're punting something, that doesn't mean you have to draft all the players that are absolutely atrocious at it. It just means that you're kind of ignoring the categories. And it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world to accidentally win field goal percent or turnovers some week, which if you have Scoot going for 5 turnovers a game, it's going to be hard for you to win that one. Basically, unless you're playing Trey's team in your fantasy league or a team that has Luka. Those are the two where you're like, all right, I got a shot. But that also means that you really can't have anybody else on your team that's bad at that category. And in all likelihood, you will, because if you're punting field goal percent and maybe turnovers or like kind of semi-punting them, you've probably leaned into guys that are also high turnover, field goal, more guard heavy. But you ain't touching that dude in a roto league. No way. And then as far as Deni Avdija goes, and to me, he's arguably the most interesting player on this roster, if only because he's not old enough where he would have to get shut down in a tank season. He's still a relatively young dude. I don't know that the league knows what his actual ceiling is going to be. Last year with Washington, he averaged about 11 shots a game, just under 15 points, 7 boards, 4 assists. So kind of a nice little well-rounded thing. 1.2 threes, 1.3 combined defensive stats, 51% from the field, 74. Not good at the free throw line. But he was pretty close to having usable fantasy value. Even in 9-cat, he finished right around the edge of the top 130. And at least, looking at the players around him on Portland, getting back to 11 shots feels doable. Although he's also one of those guys where this is just the type of player that I've kind of summarily written off in the past because he has these holes in his fantasy game, because he doesn't score as much as it feels like he's scoring, because he doesn't hit that many threes, and the defensive stats are okay, but not great. And one of the percentages is generally bad. And so with guys like that, sometimes I'll just kind of say, you know what, I don't really feel like. But one of the leaves that I've been intending to turn over a little bit going into this coming season is to look at a player like Avdija and say, what if? What if something does get fixed with this dude? What if, say, he rolls into Portland, and because he's on a team that's tanking and Jeremy Grant shuts it down part way and Ayton shuts it down part way, and maybe they don't ask him to shut it down part way, maybe you get more of that like late season Avdija stuff that we saw. I think it's been 2 years in a row with the Wizards. What if that starts to happen? Well, you still run into those same issues with him of just really not being good enough at the free throw line and field goal percent and turnovers tending to sort of trend the wrong way when he gets more responsibility. But because he has that base of points and boards and assists out of a power forward spot, is there a threshold that he could clear? Is there a possibility his free throw percent gets fixed this coming year? Does he start to add a couple more 3-pointers a game, which maybe that hurts the field goal percent, but maybe he gets the 3-pointers up to 1.5 to 2 range? Is there some sort of 1 or 2 minor tweaks that would get him up and over that hurdle? The answer, I think, is still kind of a soft no. And it's not because I don't like him. It's just because multiple things are possibilities to change, but we've now sort of seen Deni enough to know that the only thing that could really get him fixed in Portland is the free throw number. Or if you're punting that, obviously that changes things a little bit as well. But like if you're thinking about down the stretch in Washington when everybody around him was getting shut down and Avdija got a ton to do, that's a thing that might pop up in Portland as well because it's a bad team and there are 2 to 3, called 2.5 veterans with quotes around him that will crank it down the stretch. And maybe Avdija is one of those guys who gets cranked down the stretch. And that's another reason to be a little bit careful. So he's not a guy that I'm looking at earlier than about pick 120. I don't think he's going to get enough usage while the team is healthy to get to that marker. Probably makes more sense as an in-season pickup. I get it. If you're in a points league, you maybe take a shot there. You're not that worried about the percentages, and you're just kind of hoping that he does more as the season goes and guys around him fall apart or get traded or whatever. And that's a reasonable strategy. But for me, you guys know I love to get off to fast starts, and I don't think Avdija is going to get off to a super fast start as long as the Blazers come into this season with their roster mostly healthy. Team two on this 2-day breakdown is a simpler one. Yes, that's fine. We can ease our minds just a little bit. And that team is the Minnesota Timberwolves, who had very little significant roster change. Whereas the Blazers had, Avdija was a big one. Brogdon being out, Avdija coming in, and Scoot likely to do much more next year is a pretty big adjustment for that team. Whereas with the Wolves, there really isn't much. So just very quickly here, here's what Minnesota looked like last season. They had 4 players that finished the year on a per-game basis inside the top 100. They had 5, I believe, that finished inside the top 100 by totals. That 5th one that was being added in was Naz Reid. Per game, Anthony Edwards led the bunch at number 37. Cat was 43. Rudy Gobert, 51. Mike Conley, 70. A very quiet, productive year for the old GOAT. And then Naz Reid was number 120, although he went through a nice run when Cat missed his chunk of games. The big change for the Wolves this offseason is that Slow-Mo went and signed with the Golden State Warriors. Kyle Anderson averaged about 23 minutes a game last year, 6 points, 3.5 boards, 4 assists, but it's not so much about what he did when he was on the court as who his minutes could now go to. they're likely not going to ask the main guys to do a whole lot more. Conley's minutes were dialed back a bit down the stretch. They were trying to keep his legs fresh. It turned out to be, I think, a pretty good idea because the Wolves made a nice playoff run. Anthony Edwards does seem like he's a pretty damn durable dude. That's a positive, although folks assumed he was going to take this flying leap forward, but there are just, frankly, too many other guys on his team. He's up near 20 shots. There just is only so much one dude is going to do. Cat, relatively repeatable. Gobert, fairly repeatable. I think Edwards is probably going to get overdrafted. Cat is probably going to get a tiny bit overdrafted. Gobert is, remember we were just talking about like who else could you get in that 50 to 65 range that's not DeAndre Ayton? You can probably get Gobert. He's going to do much more damage to your free throw stroke than Ayton did. So you're going to have to counterweight that somehow. But Rudy was a healthier guy. And then Mike Conley just gets a year older. They don't have an obvious, I know they drafted the backup for Conley, so they don't really have an obvious veteran to sort of plop in there and say, oh, this is the guy that's going to deal with this stuff. So I think we can probably assume that Conley's role stays fairly constant year over year. Yeah, there really is nobody. And so my thought on the Wolves, and I'll try to pare this down so that the Minnesota half of our discussion is, only more like 10 minutes instead of 25, because I just don't think that there's 25 minutes worth of stuff to talk about on this side. In my eyes, the big thing is, where do the minutes go that Kyle Anderson leaves behind? I think they signed Joe Ingles, so maybe some go to Smoke a Joe. But it does feel like the most obvious recipient of those minutes, and Monte Morris is gone also, by the way, if you're thinking about, like, is there another spot that minutes could get squeezed out of? Monte only played about 15 minutes a ball game, but again, like, it's not nothing. It does kind of feel like it almost needs to be Naz Reid. Problem, of course, is that they can't really go Naz and Towns and Gobert all at the same time, where that's something that you could do with slow-mo, Towns, and Gobert. The spacing with Naz Reid out there is actually better. But Naz has always been a great fantasy producer who was like just a minute or two away from being a full season, rest of season, however you want to phrase it, kind of dude. Like, I'm not interested in Jaden McDaniels. His fantasy game just isn't there. He doesn't score. He doesn't rebound. All he really does is get you some steals, maybe a block, maybe a three-pointer. There's not enough for him. Jaden McDaniels is a fantastic basketball player. He's one of the better forward eligible defenders in the NBA, but he's just not doing it fantasy-wise. Same with everybody else downstream on this Minnesota roster. Anthony Edwards is probably going to replicate last year. Towns is probably going to replicate last year. Gobert is probably going to come close to replicating last year. Conley is probably going to come close to it. And so that really just leaves one player that you're eyeballing, and that is Naz Reid. Last year, Naz had 13.5 points, 2 3-pointers, 5.2 rebounds, 1.3 assists, 0.8 steals, 0.9 blocks, 48-74 were the splits, field goal and free throw, 1.4 turnovers, which basically makes him extraordinarily close to a player you could use every single day. What was the term? I think we called him doesn't matter guys. Like, yeah, you could start him, you could not start him. You'd be fine either way. He's not really hurting your team. And a lot of the time, he isn't really helping. But if you could, last year, isolate the window where Cat was out, which I feel was like February to March range. But honest to goodness, I don't really remember anymore exactly when it was. That was in there. When did Cat miss his ball games? Was it later? Was it earlier or later than that? Let's see here. Maybe it was later. Probably should have looked that up if I wanted to make the point. Maybe it was. Yeah, you know what? I think it was later. There we go. Okay, so Cat came back right near the end of the regular season. Beautiful. Okay, now we've isolated it. So Cat basically missed like 20 games between late February and the end of the season, effectively. That was kind of when Cat went down. It was like end of February to right near the end of the year. I think he squeezed in a few games right before the season ended. During that stretch of time, team played about 20 to 25 games during that span, and Cat missed, I think, about 20 of them. 16, 17 of them? Whatever, doesn't matter. Anthony Edwards was still late 30s, early 40s. Nothing changed for him. He actually took an extra shot and a half per game, but it didn't change his overall profile because his efficiency went down. Rudy Gobert did a little bit more. Not surprisingly, the other big man was gone, so he was asked to play a minute or two extra. Conley did a little bit less, but this is when they were sort of taking him down a gear shift or two. And Naz Reid played 29 minutes per game. Do I think that's going to happen? No, because that requires an opening at power forward or center. But whenever Slow-Mo got in there and played a power forward or a center minute, which was rare, but they happened, infrequently, but they happened, those minutes kind of have to go to Naz Reid. And more than anything, the point we're trying to make on this is if you get Naz 2.5 even extra minutes of playing time, he goes from being outside the top 100 to probably being inside of it. You're going to have some extreme explosions. He's super streaky. And then you're going to have some weeks where he is just fully non-existent. But if we can get Naz from 10.5 shots a game to 11.5, one more shot, that's all I want. And from 24 minutes to 25.5, that's all I want. 1.5 minutes more. You bring him inside the top 100. You're talking 15 points, 5.5 rebounds, 1.5 assists, pretty close to a steal and a block, over 2 3-pointers. Percentages that aren't great, but aren't bad. That's good enough. So is Naz Reid a guy I would take a shot on, like around pick 110? Yeah, I probably would. 10th rounder. Because there is that upside built in. If Towns misses a week, Naz Reid's going to go nuts. Because they don't have another option now. Like, Jaden McDaniels is going to have to play the 3. They're not going to run him out there at the 4 often. And if they do, okay, fine. Well, Naz plays every backup center minute and then some power forward. They'll kind of have no choice because he's just that good. The city loves him, too. My God, the fan base goes gaga for Naz up there. Is it going to be a breakout year? I don't think so, because Towns and Gobert are, by all accounts, healthy enough to start the year just fine. But if 24 minutes can become 25.5, which I think is attainable with no Slow-Mo around, could 1.5 of Kyle Anderson's minutes go to Naz Reid in a beautiful, magical universe? I think it's possible. So you draft him at 110. Maybe he just plods along as a doesn't matter guy for the whole year, right around pick number 100, 105, whatever. But then every once in a while, somebody goes down and kablamo. Plus, he does a little bit of everything, so that's kind of nice too. Do we need to worry about any of these other guys? Nah, I don't think so. Nickeil Alexander-Walker will have his one game, he explodes, and then everybody will be like, should I do something? And I'll be like, no. We've seen this. We've done this thing before. Rob Dillingham, by the way, was the player they traded for on draft night that I think they're hoping they can groom to be Mike Conley's replacement at some point. And you'll see Ingles get in there and he'll play the Slow-Mo role. But Joe Ingles is 36 and had a monster injury a year and a half ago. So I don't think they expect him to play all that much. So, it feels like they can force feed a tiny bit more to Naz Reid. Just a tiny bit. Not asking for much. I'm not asking for the world here. Just a little bitty bit. That'll get us there. Please take a moment here towards the tail end to like, rate, and subscribe. If those of you that actually made it this far, congratulations on your achievement today. Particularly if you're watching, that's where you can hit the thumbs up button. That's helpful. Subscriptions, no matter how you're taking it in, that's also a big deal. And if you have a minute, 1 minute, that's all it takes. It's your mitzvah of the day. Please go do a 5-star on Spotify or a 5-star with a review on Apple. That stuff is really big because we are starting to see a little bit more traction these days, probably thanks to free agency. And we are, at least according to a friend of the program, Dan Titus, we're probably we might be as short as 3 weeks away from Yahoo League's opening. So that, ooh, baby. Can you believe, ooh, man, when those leagues open, should we do a mock on the very first day? Of course we should. Hot diggity dog. It could be 3 weeks away. It might be a tiny bit more than that. Dan was given a kind of a ballpark, but I know Yahoo's aiming for early August. Chef's kiss. At Dan Vespers on Twitter, at Old Man Squad, which again, will follow you back. If you follow it, it will follow you. Yeah, it's a sheep. What are you going to do? Old Man Squad, spelled how it sounds. Hit me up if you want to be a part of what we're doing over here. If you want to host a show or something like that. Again, no real pressure. We're just having fun, doing some cool stuff. Might as well do it together. Have a great whatever the hell day it is. It's Thursday, I'm told, by the fake producer in my ear. It's Thursday. And we'll wrap up the week tomorrow, hopefully with the great Rhett Bauer. I've got to make sure my scheduling stuff lines up. We got some logistical things going on the home front. But it's supposed to be Rhett tomorrow, and if it doesn't happen, it's entirely, again, my fault. So remember we talked about last week how if there's guff, you should guff me. Be ready to hit me with all the guff if I screw up the Rhett appearance. It'll be happening soon either way, and I'm hoping we can figure out a way to make it work for tomorrow. And if we can, Rhett's going to break us down a bunch of Dynasty stuff. He's a fun dude to sit back and listen to. That's what we're going to do on tomorrow's show. Nils says, please do the mock. Don't worry, buddy. My goal is once leagues are open to do 3 to 5 mocks live a week on these channels. That's the goal. We'll do them quick, too. Like little 20-minute, pop them out. Yahoo goes fast. I think there's a 30-second timer on those things. You zip right through. I mean, you guys don't care what happens after the first 8 or 9 rounds anyway, because people start leaving, and the end of those mocks gets kind of dumb. We'll do some mocks with folks from Twitter, from YouTube, whatever. We'll get you guys in there. I like to do a mix of them, because if it's all listeners, then they're all targeting the same players as me, and we don't learn much. It's like, oh my God, all the guys we want are going early. We better go earlier. Nah, not always the case. All right. Those listening after the fact, you probably got this one in 2 separate show chunks. Those that watch, you get it all rolled into one. That's how we're doing it with these team previews. Again, Rhett tomorrow, and that'll wrap up our week. I'm Dan Vespers. We'll see you then.